These children woke up as ordinary orphans in a Montreal institution, and by the next morning they had become idiots and morons on paper. One 11-year-old boy named Hervé Bertrand went to bed on March 17, 1955, as a normal child attending classes at the Mount Providence Orphanage. When he woke on March 18th, he was officially classified as an idiot. No test was given, no doctor examined him, just a stroke of a pen by the nuns who ran the place. That single change meant the Roman Catholic Church running the orphanage would now collect more than 3 times the government money to house him. 75 cents a day for an orphan became $2.75 a day for a so-called mental defective, and Hervé was far from alone. Here's what nobody talks about. In the 1940s and 1950s, under Premier Maurice Duplessis, the Quebec government and the Catholic Church worked together to transform thousands of healthy orphans into psychiatric patients overnight. The official count of children affected runs into the thousands, but when you include every institution across the province, the number climbs toward 20,000 souls, relabeled so the church could triple its cash. These were not babies born with severe disabilities. Many were the children of unwed mothers, teenagers who had been surrendered at birth, or youngsters whose parents had simply fallen on hard times. They had already lost their families. Now they lost their futures too. Let me take you back to the beginning of this nightmare. Quebec, in the 1940s, was firmly under the control of Maurice Duplessis, a man known as Le Chef. He ran the province with an iron fist and the full blessing of the Catholic Church, which operated virtually every orphanage, school, and hospital. The church had been taking in illegitimate children for decades. These little ones were often called enfants du péché, children of sin. They filled institutions like Mount Providence, run by the Sisters of Providence in Montreal. The government paid the nuns 75 cents per child per day to feed, clothe, and supposedly educate them. It was not much, but it kept the system running. Then federal money became available for mental health care, but not for orphanages. The rules were clear. Psychiatric patients qualified for higher subsidies from Ottawa. Orphans did not. So Duplessis and the church struck a deal that would shock anyone with a conscience. They simply changed the labels. Orphanages were quietly converted into mental institutions on paper. Normal children became feeble-minded morons, imbeciles, or idiots in the official records. No new buildings were needed. No actual medical evaluations were required in most cases. Just new paperwork, new diagnoses, and suddenly the per-child payment nearly quadrupled. The math was brutally simple. Take 20,000 children, multiply the daily difference of $2 by 365 days. Then, multiply by the years this system ran. The church and the government stood to gain millions upon millions of extra dollars, all extracted from the lives of children who had done nothing wrong except be born to the wrong mothers or lose their parents too soon. Hervé Bertrand's story is one of the few that survived in detail. He told reporters years later how the nuns informed the children they were now retarded. Some were moved to actual psychiatric wings. Others stayed in the same buildings but under new classifications that followed them for life. Their birth records were altered. Their medical files now carried stamps that would prevent adoption, prevent education, prevent any chance of a normal life. They became property of the system in a way even the orphan label had never allowed. Here's what nobody talks about when people discuss the so-called Duplessis Orphans. This was not a secret program hidden in the shadows. It was done openly, with the full cooperation of the highest levels of the church and the provincial government. Bishops and premiers shook hands over the bodies of children. The same institutions that preached about charity and the sanctity of life turned those children into revenue streams. Some survivors later described how the nuns would line them up and announce new diagnoses, like handing out report cards from hell. One day you were a student, the next you were a defective. The terminology they used came straight from the dark science of the early 20th century. Moron was not a schoolyard insult back then. It was an official medical category invented by Henry Goddard in 1910 for people with what we would now call mild intellectual disability. But in Quebec, they applied it broadly and carelessly to anyone who could bring in more money. Idiots, imbeciles, morons. The labels were changed almost at random. Children who could read and write suddenly had files claiming they were incapable of learning. Teenagers who worked in the orphanage gardens were declared mentally unfit for anything but institutional life, and the cash flowed. The higher payments allowed the church to expand its network of institutions. More buildings, more land, more control over the unwanted children of Quebec. Some of these places became notorious for overcrowding, abuse, and neglect. Children who had entered as orphans found themselves trapped in asylums, where they witnessed horrors no young person should see. Older teens were sometimes used as unpaid labor in laundries or farms attached to the facilities. The ones labeled lowest functioning were often kept drugged or isolated. By the 1950s, this system had been running for years. Federal auditors rarely questioned the sudden explosion in psychiatric cases among children who had no previous history of mental illness. The church had the records. The government had the incentive. Together they buried the truth under layers of bureaucracy and religious authority. Who would dare question the nuns or the premier when both claimed to be saving souls and protecting society? Now here is where the story becomes even darker. Many of these children were not orphans in the truest sense. Some had living parents who'd placed them temporarily during hard times. Others were illegitimate but loved by extended family who were never told about the reclassification. Once the label was applied, it became almost impossible to remove. Adoption agencies would not touch a child stamped as moron. Schools turned them away. Even when families came looking years later, the records showed their relative was severely disabled and better off institutionalized. Survivors like Hervé Bertrand spent decades fighting to clear their names. In the 1990s, they began speaking out, forming associations and demanding justice. They described systematic physical and sexual abuse in some of the asylums. They told of children who simply disappeared. They produced documents proving the mass relabeling had been coordinated from the top. One government report after another confirmed what the victims already knew. This had been a calculated financial scheme dressed up as medical care and Christian mercy. The church, for its part, denied knowledge or responsibility for many years. Some officials claimed the children really were disabled. Others said times were different and mistakes were made. But the payment difference tells the real story. 75 cents versus $2.75. The numbers do not lie. The incentives were clear. The church stood to gain enormously by turning its orphanages into psychiatric facilities, and that is exactly what it did. Think about what this means for an entire generation of Quebec children. 20,000 lives altered with the stroke of a pen. 20,000 futures erased so that institutions could collect more government money. These were not abstract numbers. These were boys and girls who learned to walk in church nurseries, who said their first prayers in Latin, who looked to the nuns as mothers only to be betrayed by the very hands that were supposed to protect them. Some of them never recovered. They carried the labels into adulthood. Jobs were denied. Marriages were discouraged. Families were never formed. The psychological damage of being told you are a moron when you know you are not is something that echoes down through generations. Children who grew up in those places often struggled to trust anyone again, especially religious authorities. Many changed their names or moved away from Quebec entirely, trying to outrun the paperwork that had defined them. Here's what nobody talks about even today. This scandal reveals how deeply the church and state were intertwined in mid-20th century Canada. The same system that baptized these children at birth later declared them less than human to balance the books. Charity became commerce. Salvation became a line item. And the babies and teens caught in the middle paid with their childhoods, their identities, and in some cases, their lives. The Duplessis era finally ended with the Premier's death in 1959, but the institutions continued operating under the new labels for years. It was not until the 1990s that serious investigations began. In 2006, the Quebec government offered a modest settlement to surviving Duplessis orphans. Many called it blood money. Too little, too late for people who had lost decades of their lives. Some refused the payments on principle, demanding instead a full public inquiry and formal apologies from the church. Those apologies have been slow in coming, if they have come at all. The documents still exist in archives across Quebec, yellowing files with children's names crossed out and new diagnoses written in their place, birth certificates altered, school records destroyed or hidden. The evidence is there for anyone willing to look, yet this chapter of history remains strangely quiet in most textbooks. You will find more about the orphan trains in the United States or the foundling wheels in Europe than you will about the 20,000 Quebec children turned into morons for profit. What happened to the ones who were never reclassified? What stories did they carry about their friends who suddenly became defective? And what about the thousands whose files were lost or deliberately destroyed? The children who lived through this are elderly now. Their voices are fading, but the lesson remains brutally clear. When institutions prioritize cash over compassion, even the most vulnerable become commodities. Orphans who had no parents became pawns in a game between politicians and prelates. Their only crime was needing care in a world that saw them as a burden unless they could be monetized as mental patients. So the next time you hear someone praise the good works of religious charities in the past, remember Hervé Bertrand. Remember the boy who went to bed normal and woke up an idiot. Remember the 20,000 others whose lives were rewritten, not by fate but by greed. Their stories are not ancient history. They unfolded in the lifetime of our parents and grandparents, and they force us to ask uncomfortable questions about every system that claims to protect children while profiting from their suffering. Where else has this happened? How many other labels have been applied in the name of funding? And how many family trees hold secrets of children who were erased not from existence, but from their own identities, all so the church could triple its cash? The answers are still out there, buried in forgotten files and silenced voices. The children are waiting for us to remember them. The labels may have faded, but the damage never did.